Hello. As your setup for our unit on the Renaissance, we're going to take some time and take a look at the 1,000 years leading up to the Renaissance in Europe, a time you probably know well as the Middle Ages. In some ways, the Middle Ages, also known as medieval times, the word medieval simply means Middle Ages. In a sense, it is kind of civilization's midlife crisis, if you would. It begins in around 500 AD or CE with the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of classical civilization when learning and power and empire seemed to be in the prime of life. And after that followed a period of stepping back. Where exactly do you go next? Kind of the way most of us will get when we reach midlife. With luck, you'll get to experience that someday. Not for a while yet, anyway. In any case, eventually you work your way through the midlife stage by looking for new things, figuring out where you're going to go and maybe if there's different ways to get there. And it's going to conclude around 1500 AD or CE with a new beginning, a rebirth, if you would, known as the Renaissance. For our purposes, we're going to split this period up into two screencasts. This first one will focus on the early Middle Ages, from 500 to about 1000 AD, also known as the Dark Ages. As we said, it begins with the fall of the Roman Empire, and Western Europe in particular was dominated by uh, nomadic German tribes that had basically trashed a lot of the Western European cities set up by the Romans. These tribes tended to wander around. Uh, they tended not to form very big nations, very big groups. Personal loyalty was extremely important to them, as you'll see when they developed the social system called feudalism, which we're going to get to in a second. The early Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, best known for one, the social order known as feudalism, and second, and this is going to come into play both in the Renaissance and in the Reformation unit later on, the rise of the Catholic Church in Western Europe. Feudalism was a social system developed throughout Europe. It was very localized and based on three factors. One, the family you were born into would determine your social class. Part of that class was also a function of how much land you owned. With little travel or trade going on, money was not particularly significant at this time. Land, being something literally solid and something that was perceived as having value, was much more important. The third factor, and one of the most important in this system, was the idea of loyalty or service. As we said, cities had broken down in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire. As a result, most people in Europe during the early Middle Ages in particular lived on estates called manors. In American studies, you may have learned about the old plantations in the antebellum or pre Civil War South. Manors were not unlike those plantations, with one significant difference. Where the old southern plantations in America grew cash crops like cotton and tobacco, manors were more often than not self sufficient. They didn't grow much or produce much in the way of trade. Everything they produced was for their own use, from their food, their tools, their housing, and their livelihoods. Manors often were walled in for defense against other towns or other feudal lords that might have an eye on adding to the territory. The center of a manor was often the manor house, where the lord of the manor lived. Contained within the manor, you would also find shops for whatever craftsmen were there, huts for the workers who lived on the manor, and usually a local parish church serviced by the local priest. We'll talk more about the church's role in a moment. Feudal society, as most social classes, was set up according to a pyramid system. At the top was the king, at the bottom were peasants and serfs. The whole system was set up according to the idea of a feudal contract. A contract, of course, takes two sides. In this case, the contract was between a lord who gave parts of his land to vassals who in return promised their loyalty or service. For example, the king would dish out some land to lords. In return, the lords pledged their service and their loyalty to the king. In turn, the lords would pass along some land to lesser vassals or knights, who in turn pledged their service to the lords, who in turn had pledged their service to the king. It's kind of a chain reaction, but what it does is it allows the king, in an emergency, to summon an army at almost any time because everybody owed somebody in the system. That's the effectiveness of feudalism, is that everything was in its place, and as long as the bonds of loyalty held up, then the system could hold up. That's where you see the development of what's called chivalry. The word itself comes from cheval, which is the French word for horse, which is appropriate because horses are what knights rode. Today, mounted soldiers are referred to as cavalry. Chivalry started as a set of rules for combat between or among knights, the idea of a fair fight. You may have seen footage of the jousts where if one knight knocks the other off the horse, then that knight needs to get down on the ground in order to fight fairly with the guy he's knocked off the horse. Eventually, chivalry became a lot more than that. Today, we don't think of chivalry as much as a set of rules for combat as we do a general code of conduct. This is where we get the traditions like taking your hat off indoors or holding the door for your grandma when you're taking her to the store or things like that. Now, we do think of the Middle Ages as a time of kings and lords and knights and damsels in distress and so forth. It's important to remember here that only about 10% of Europe's population were the people in the first three levels of this pyramid, nobles and lords. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were peasants or serfs, people who worked the land, and in the case of serfs, were legally bound to the land. They never could leave, and in fact, if the land ever changed hands, the serfs effectively changed hands also. Not unlike slaves, they were pretty much considered as property. Most people would end up living, working, and dying within a few miles of the place they were born. Imagine never really going anywhere else or doing anything else. And that's what these folks were about. The average life expectancy was 30 years. Obviously, it would go up, usually with social class. The higher your class, the higher the average life expectancy. But in this case, with only 30 years on this earth, it would make sense that they were very much concerned with the afterlife, what comes next. After all, you're going to be spending a lot more time there than you will here. And that takes us into the role of the Catholic Church. This map shows the rough religious distribution across Europe during the Middle Ages. As you can see, the Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity is dominant in Eastern Europe, mixing with Islam here in the Middle East. And over here in the West, in the orange, you can see that the Roman Catholic Church is almost completely dominant, with the exception of Muslim inroads into Spain, which won't be changed until near the end of the Middle Ages. But you can see how the Catholic Church maintained a dominant position in Europe. The Catholic Church was created during the time of the Roman Empire, and in fact, it is the one element of the empire that survived the fall. As you saw from the map, it was the one unifying element in Western Europe. With all the feudal tribes and all the manors, it was the church that was the constant wherever you went. The church positioned itself as the go between for man and God, and it was the final determinant of your salvation. Would your soul be delivered from sin? Would it be allowed to enter into heaven? This graphic here shows you that the social structure of feudalism also applied in many ways to the structure of the church. God at the top, with the ruler of the state or the manor, a king, the Pope at the head of the Catholic Church, and down through cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, and monks, and down here, the churchgoers themselves. Like feudalism, the church was very much arranged according to a hierarchy. Once again, the advantage being if everything is in its place, you know where you stand, you know where you are, and the system is likely to stay in place. What was required for salvation? Well, the pattern usually required, of course, believing in God, believing in the religion, but there were also so called good works attached to it. There were certain duties or responsibilities. You might be familiar with the five pillars of Islam, such as daily prayer, giving to the poor, traveling to Mecca. In the case of the Catholic Church, there were good works also. For example, you were expected to attend Mass on a regular basis, Mass being the weekly service. You could, however, attend Mass more often than once a week. And once again, this was usually dependent upon your social class. Why do you think workers or serfs probably attended church once a week, while the lord of the manor might attend Mass on a daily basis? Could have something to do with the time they had available. Think about what the serfs and peasants are doing more or less 6 days a week, sun up to sundown. Not a lot of time for religion there. So, how do you make up for it if you don't go to Mass on a daily basis? Well, there were also required rituals, seven, which you see here, literally taking the person from birth, baptism, all the way to death, the last rites or anointing of the sick. We'll be talking about that a lot more when we get to the Protestant Reformation. People were also expected to tithe if possible, pledging up to 10% of their income to the church. Since the church was universal across Western Europe and virtually everybody was tithing, this meant the church came into tremendous amounts of wealth, both in land and money. And this is going to give them a great deal of power and authority to do a lot of things. Another factor that came into play was the use of relics. It was believed by many Catholics that the remains of saints or other holy objects had a sort of spiritual power, and collecting and use of relics was considered important in some circles. Again, we'll reference this when we get to the Reformation. The church related well to feudal lords and kings. As in the feudal contract, each side provided something that the other one needed. For example, the church would provide their blessing and support for the ruling classes. In this case, Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne the leader of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. When the Pope himself is crowning you, it's as good as God's endorsement. and that was going to very much keep the rest of your kingdom in line. In turn, the lords and kings would do some of the legwork for the church, collecting tithes, providing protection from outside invaders, and loyal, once again, as in the feudal contract, loyalty and service. At the same time, the church did control a lot of money, but they also converted much of it, into truly good works. If you were sick, the church might have the people trained in medicine to help you. If you were hungry, the church would often provide food in the form of bread lines or what we would think of as soup kitchens today. If people needed shelter, literally shelter from the storm or sanctuary, the church could often provide that. So, for a lot of reasons, the church was very much a central part of not only politics and money, but very much a part of everyday life during the Middle Ages. At this point, we'll stop and we'll take up the second half of the Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages, in the next screencast. What we'll do with this is take a look at the steps taken by Europe that moves them closer to what we know as the Renaissance.